Good morning. This is an encore presentation of Creating Safe Cultures, Psychological Safety in the Family Enterprise. My name is Dr. Richard Ray. I'm with Workforce Systems Design, and I was asked to speak about the impact that psychological safety has in family-owned enterprises, to speak a little bit about family-owned enterprises and help conference attendees better understand the concept of psychological safety. The conference was on November 2nd, 2023 in Greenville, South Carolina, and it was entitled Timeless Truths and Timely Topics, Lessons for the Family Enterprise. And the keynote speaker for this event was Stephanie Stuckey, who talked about revitalization of her family brand. Workforce Systems Design provides a variety of services, including executive coaching, succession planning, training and development, design and implementation, strategy, assessment, strategic planning, change management, and HR consulting. Our general concept is we want to help you invest in your workforce so you can grow your firm. As we begin to understand psychological safety, we really need to understand where it comes from and what impact it has on us as individuals and in organizations. And so we go back to the original Maslow hierarchy of needs. Essentially, we start at the bottom of this pyramid where a person has to satisfy certain physiological needs like satisfying hunger and thirst, getting rest, and having comfort. As they move up this hierarchy, they go to a point where they desire safety and look to satisfy safety needs through security. It can be shelter, it can be income, it can be any of those types of things. As we continue to move up the hierarchy, we begin to now focus on social needs, love, and belongingness. And essentially, these three, physiological safety, security, and social needs, are the ones that we'll talk most about when we talk about psychological safety. Eventually, as you move up through the hierarchy of needs, you get into esteem needs where you're focused on accomplishment and achieving things. And eventually you get to self-actualization where it's about your own growth and development. Over the years, though, Maslow had originally intended to be 5 basic needs, but over the years, other people have added things like the need to know, or the need for knowledge, and the need for beauty. Those will not be discussed as part of this presentation. In this presentation, we'll be talking about the impact of family-owned businesses, challenges and successes that family-owned businesses face. We'll define psychological safety, talk about psychological safety in the workplace, and then we'll go through an exercise where you'll be able to map out your family-owned business culture. So before we understand psychological safety and define elements of the family-owned business, it's important that we all have a general understanding of culture in organizations. Culture begins with values. Typically, these values are driven by the executive. We often say that leaders define the values, and we'll discuss that a little bit more. These are beliefs that you hold so dear, that you believe so much, that no matter what, you would not let them go. Values, and then how you preference your behavior and the way that you address conflict and the way that you use your personality and how you understand your own motivation as well as the motivation of others is very important here. For instance, most people are motivated by one of 3 types of motivations. The motivation or desire to achieve, the motivation and desire to be affiliated with others, develop relationships, and a motivation for power to control. Personality, typically we think about this in terms of your extroversion, your introversion, how you like to make decisions, how you like to collect data, and how you organize your life. And then when we talk about conflict, we're typically talking about what is your general approach to conflict? Do you see conflict as innovation? Do you see conflict as something to avoid? Is every conflict an opportunity to compete or to take from others? Or is conflict about escaping and avoiding? In your culture, there's these non-negotiables. These are things that you won't give up. Often this can be defined in terms of a desire or a behavior that the organization leadership has determined is important. For instance, I value integrity, and I want people to engage each other in an honest, open way. If you engage in a way that is not open and not one of integrity, then you probably aren't going to be successful in my company. So integrity, trust, they're non-negotiables. Leader behaviors continually change and redefine as the organization grows. These leader behaviors aren't just the behaviors of the executive, they're the behaviors that are cascaded throughout the organization. And then there's expectations. We set expectations for ourselves, for our employees, for our teammates, and for the organization. Now, these expectations are communicated in ways that allow us to know what is expected of us. And then there's accountabilities that are developed based on those expectations. And our culture will often have many expectations and be defined by values and be driven by leaders and have those non-negotiables that we think about. But if you don't have an accountability regimen built into your organization, then it doesn't matter what you say you're going to do. There's no consequence. So those are very important to think about as you think about your culture. And as one person told me, culture isn't what we say it is, it's what we allow it to be. So in understanding culture, we also need to understand how we use teams, how we value teams, and how we lead teams. Are they more democratic? Are they more autocratic? Are teams a place where you can challenge and be comfortable in that? We also want to be aware of what organizational behaviors are accepted and not accepted and how those behaviors extend outside of the organization. And then the last piece of culture really goes back to a gentleman named Edgar Schein, who said that there's these unwritten rules and artifacts in organizations. Sometimes we don't see them, and sometimes they're glaring. Artifacts can be things as simple as a coffee cup or a photo or a mantra that's emblazed on a wooden plaque that you hang outside the door. It can be something that reminds you of how your organization was founded and what continues to be important to that organization. Unwritten rules are a little more complicated. These are the things that everyone knows, but no one dares to say. And the example I use often is the CEO who always parked in the same spot of his parking lot, but yet there were no assigned parking spaces. He just parked in the same spot every day. Once, when the young executive was riding with him, they drove into the parking lot, and the CEO says, "Wow, I hope I find a place to park." And the young executive said, "But that's your parking spot right there. It's where you park every day." And of course, the CEO, surprised, said, "No, we don't have assigned parking." So for the next few days, he parked in a different spot. And within 2 weeks, that was the spot that people knew to stay away from because that was a CEO spot, as well as the original parking spot. So unwritten rules are very powerful, and sometimes they guide us in more ways than official policies don't. So take a moment and think about, what does your culture look like? In your family-owned business, if you ask your customers, your employees, your coworkers about the culture, what words would they say? Take a few moments and reflect. Are those positive words? Are those negative words? One of the things I like to do with my clients is I like for them to have some representation of culture with them all the time. One way to do this is take two simple index cards. On one of them, on the front of one of the cards, write what your values and non-negotiables are. On the back of that, what are the consequences for adhering to or not adhering to those consequences? On a second index card, you can actually write what you think psychological safety looks like in your organization. This will be much easier after we go through that section on what is psychological safety. So let's keep that blank for now. And then on the back of that card, you'll want to write what leaders need to do to make sure that you are in a psychological safe environment. And if you're not in a psychological safe environment, what actions do you take to get there? So tuck those index cards away. We'll continue to use them throughout our presentation. And once they're done, I would recommend you laminate them or put them in a Ziploc bag, whatever you need to do so that you can protect them and take them out periodically and hold yourself accountable. So for the next few moments, we're going to talk about the impact of the family-owned business. Many of you know how important family-owned businesses are, but I just want to recap for the rest of the group so that we're clear. Family businesses are economic drivers. They account for about 64% of the U.S. gross domestic product. They generate 62% of U.S. employment. They account for 78% of all new jobs, and 35% of Fortune 500 firms are family controlled. They also represent 62% of the total jobs in the U.S. workforce. So essentially, 997,000 jobs out of the 156,000 that exist. And they account for 75% of all new jobs. In family-owned businesses, the leadership team is less likely to lay off employees regardless of the financial performance of or what's happening in the economy. And there's some great examples of this over the years with companies like W.C. Bradley out of Columbus, Georgia, Russell Athletic in the mid-1990s in eastern Alabama. They also comprise the greatest part of the U.S. wealth. 90% of all firms existing started as a family-owned business. And family-owned businesses typically stay around. The mean age for a family controlling a company is about 60 years. And the general transition from one generation to the next looks like this. About 30% make it into the second generation. About 12% make it into the third generation, with only about 3% of family-owned businesses moving to the fourth level or fourth generation. Leadership tenure in family-owned businesses tends to be 5 times longer than their counterparts. And this makes sense if you think about it. If you start a business and that business is operating, you're going to operate in it until you think it's ready. And by that time, your successor could be old enough at this point to take the reins of the company. When the company was started, maybe they were a toddler. Family wealth holders, the stockholders, the stakeholders, believe they're not only transferring financial gains, but they're also transitioning or transforming by sharing values to the next generation. often when we look at family-owned businesses that struggle in the second, third, and fourth generation, it's typically because the financials transition, the legal transition, but the values from that first generation to that second, third, or fourth generation are so different that the company doesn't feel the same. It's how you'll hear employees talk about it. And if we look at some major companies that are in their second, third generation now in the US, it's easy to see how some feel that the founding company or founders in a company such as Hilton have very different values than, let's say, the present generation of Hilton offspring. Employees tend to like working for family-owned businesses, and when we look at turnover, it's less than 9%. Those employees are also highly engaged, and they typically feel like they're a part of the family or part of contributing in ways that people in non-employed, non-family-owned businesses don't express. The typical turnover rate is about 15%. In some organizations and others like construction and less than high-tech manufacturing, you could see turnover as much as 30%. Again, with the exception of family-owned enterprises. Family-owned businesses generate a lot of wealth. The ROI is greater in family-owned businesses. Typically, you see a higher return on investment in family firms. Family-owned businesses, especially the CEO, the founding generation, you see often that they not only own one business, they own over their lifetime, 6 firms or 5 firms, or either they acquire firms through merger and acquisition, or they spin off their original firm to find something new. We see this with a lot of construction companies that may have started out as a full-service construction company, and then they will spin off the electrical aspects of it, or they may create an interior design firm to supplement or to be connected to the business, but yet a separate business. We also see that when we think about wealth generation and family-owned businesses, most are concerned not just about that next quarter, not just the next year. Often they're looking years down the road, and they will put customers and employees first and emphasize social responsibility in the short and long term when others may not. A Harvard study actually indicated that 40% of all family-owned businesses included their next generation on their boards and committees, and they nurture the business as they nurture their business skills and their management skills. And Stephanie Stuckey's presentation on her firm, she talked about the importance of bringing in cousins and nephews early into the process and making sure they understood how the business worked. Some challenges we often see with family-owned businesses are similar to other businesses, but you see other businesses run into. But in this case, we're going to talk about challenges that are specific to the family business. Right now, many of the owners are long in the tooth and expect to retire in the next 8 years, but less than half of those expecting to retire in 5 years have selected a successor. Often, they don't really have a succession plan. And if they do, it's more of a financial or legal succession plan that looks at structures and reporting relationships, but not family relationships. And so we often say that many lawyers and financial advisors start the process and they find conflict. What we often suggest to our clients is that essentially you bring the family members together and you talk about expectations and values and whether or not they want to be involved in the business, and if they do, how they want to be involved in the business, and then talk realistically about if those family members have the capability to lead the enterprise. Having those conversations up front makes the legal structuring and the financial decisions much easier when when that time comes. 70% of all owners want to pass their business down, but only about 30% will actually be successful. And often family-owned businesses believe that their ethical standards are much more stringent than their competitors. This hasn't been proved through research, and often you have a conflict between what the owners say they want to do and want to be versus what employees and customers and other stakeholders actually see. And so, and again, about 64% will engage some type of assistance, usually a lawyer or a financial advisor, but very few actually work on the family relationships. Psychological safety. We act as though this is something new. We act as though we've not thought about this or we haven't dealt with this before. And as we talk about primarily Amy Edmondson's interpretation of psychological safety, which she began exploring in the late 90s and continues today be incredibly influential, we actually have people as early as the 1940s, the example here of Deming, where people were talking about reducing fear so that people feel like they can contribute to the company, so that they can raise questions. Now, Deming was looking at it from the perspective of, if you want to improve your processes, you have to have people engaged in that conversation. If they are fearful, they won't engage. My time in the hospital industry has been interesting from the perspective of seeing the role of the physician, let's speak specifically to a surgical suite, changing quite dramatically. In the old days, the surgeon would walk in, he or she would tell people what to do, they would look at the chart, and then they would begin the procedure. Today, essentially, while the patient is still there, and sometimes while the patient is still awake, each person will talk about their part of the surgery, what they're going to do, what they need to do. This could include administrative or clinical people. And essentially, you're providing the space for people to raise their concerns, so that you get the best possible outcome. And there's no judgment, there's no fear, there's no intimidation. The outcome is the patient. So when it comes to psychological safety, again, Amy Edmondson of Harvard is the authority. She more or less in her articles and books has defined psychological safety as the belief that no one will be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, or concerns, or when they point out mistakes, and that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. Psychological safety in the workplace is the ability to foster a culture empowering individuals to express ideas, raise concerns, ask questions, challenge a process, and offer divergent views without feeling afraid to experience an unfavorable impact for the team. She and others, when they talk about psychological safety, have emphasized that you have to have trust and you have to have respect before you have psychological safety. If you have neither or only one of those, you won't get what you need. So for a moment, think about that definition. It's about engaging and risk-taking and sharing ideas and learning, is how my organizational behavioral friends would talk about it. But why is psychological safety important? You're right. Employee engagement improves. If I feel like I belong, the environment is safe, I'm going to be engaged. You're right. Inclusive. When we have an organization that's psychologically safe, we have people who feel like they can engage. We also have more diverse views that contribute to a healthier culture. We also get more creativity, greater collaboration, better employee well-being, reduce employee turnover, and increased levels of team performance. Again, you're creating an environment that says this is important, we're going to improve. Now, some people say, wow, this is great. The touchy-feely stuff is wonderful. But if we just look at something like turnover and how psychological safety impacts turnover, it decreases it and increases engagement. And we know that about $600 billion a year is lost on employee turnover. So the benefits are there. We also see that if I go to training and come back to the workplace, there's a 67% greater chance that I'm actually going to apply that learning. We also see about 77% more engagement in our employees and a decrease in overall employee stress. When we look at things like satisfaction, so again, this isn't really engagement. This is, do I like being here? Am I happy? About 30% more in psychologically safe environments report they are. 57% of employees feel like they can collaborate more, and 50% feel like that there's an increased productivity because they're in a psychologically safe environment. Sometimes, as with the Supreme Court definition of obscenity, sometimes seeing the absence of something is the best way to define that something. So here we have the elements of what we would call psychological danger, or a culture that is psychologically dangerous. There's a fear of making mistakes, blaming others. People who fear making mistakes and being blamed are less likely to share a divergent view or a different view. And then we get into this common knowledge effect. We don't really know the information. We don't know the data. We're not sure how people are going to respond. So we just assume whatever the common knowledge is the only answer. So there's no risk taking. There's no change. People are more resistant to change. The innovation, culture, engagement's all more stagnant. And there's these negative elements of the culture that seep in every time we think about doing something. So no matter what the idea is, no matter what the innovation is, what the new product is, there's a negativity that's associated with it. Now we call this playing not to lose. Playing not to lose is the old Larry Wilson concept that essentially says when we go into organizations, when we go into a meeting and Richard is trying to compete with Terry, Terry's a smart guy and it's hard to keep up with Terry. And over time, Richard learns that Terry, in order to keep up, sometimes either I have to step back or I have to make Terry look less than effective. So when Terry is presenting to the boss, I roll my eyes. When Terry comes into a room and people begin to listen to him, I actively and in a very public way will look at my telephone or rattle through papers or have a conversation on the side. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm not trying to win anymore. I'm just trying to make sure Terry doesn't win, which means I'm playing not to lose. In this kind of environment, you see decreased productivity, you see low morale, you see people avoiding risk. No one takes initiative. Decision-making just disappears because we continue to push that off for fear of getting into trouble. Again, high turnover, low retention, conflict is unresolved and unproductive. You've seen this in organizations where people are upset about something that happened 10 or 15 years ago, or maybe a month ago, but because we're not resolving it, we're not working on it, it gets worse and worse, and it has an enduring impact. Resistance to change in a psychologically dangerous organization is often overt and covert, meaning I'll let you know I don't want to do this, but more importantly, I'm going to meet around the water cooler with folks, or I'm going to go out socially with folks, and I'm going to talk about the change and let it slowly get back into the organization that we're not going to do this. There's all kinds of error issues and quality and performance issues in organizations that are considered psychologically dangerous. And in these environments, people will not ask questions. And when an organization stops asking questions, when employees feel like they no longer can ask, that's when really bad things start to happen. So, one reason people won't ask, they believe people won't listen. They don't want to share their opinions. They're concerned about the respect of others. They're concerned that they might be belittled or laughed at or criticized. They don't want to be left out. They want to belong. And sometimes when we ask questions, we're perceived as a troublemaker, or what's your real point? What are you trying to get at? We're not open to discovery as much as we should be. I think if you look at this list of reasons that people won't ask questions, you can probably pull up 2 or 3 and be reminded of a time when this was an issue. So now that we know what psychological safety isn't, let's talk about what it is. The cycle is very similar in the sense that you have 4 major approaches or 4 major landing zones. There's comfort in admitting mistakes. So I know I made the mistake. How do I get better? And this reminds me of the old Jack Welch story of failing on a project, losing $10 million, boxing up his items in a box, and then going to the CEO of General Electric, explaining what had happened, and then handing his boss a resignation letter. And of course, the boss says, well, thanks for letting me know, but why would I take your resignation? I just spent $10 million training you. So there's a comfort in knowing that if I make a mistake, I'm not going to be ostracized, I'm not going to be fired, but we're going to look at that as an opportunity to learn and grow and make sure, 1, I don't make that mistake again, and 2, that others don't make a similar mistake. So if we have that general approach that it's really about learning, then everyone can share ideas. Everyone can help improve and innovate and make decisions. And again, we get into the cycle of being okay. Again, not focusing on making mistakes, but when mistakes happen, we know it's not going to be the end. We know we're going to be supported, which could look like a lot of different things. It could be more training, it could be development, it could be better resources, better data collection, better critical thinking. But the idea is, in a psychologically safe environment, risk-taking improves, we're open to change, we have a growth mindset, and we have a learning culture. So where previously we were concerned about playing to lose, now this is truly playing to win. And just as you would expect, the employees look very different in a psychologically safe environment, especially as it relates to team performance. You see people taking initiative and operating by trust. They're not afraid. They're asking questions. They're suggesting things. Conflict is not something bad or something that happens to us. It's an opportunity to learn and grow and change. And people aren't threatened by new ideas. They're trusted. So really, you get to decide. Do you want to be an organization that's driven by fear and looks to blame others when things don't go the way you want? Or is it an organization where we learn from our failures, we try to make less failures by learning from them, we're open, we take risk, we're open to change, and we're growing? And so again, you get to make that choice. And whose choice is it? That's right, the leaders. So let's talk about psychological safety in the workplace. There's typically 4 stages of psychological safety that we hear people speaking of. There's inclusion safety, learner safety, collaborator safety, and challenger safety. And essentially, you move through these types of psychological safety. Now, as you move through them, they require a greater degree of comfort, a greater level of support, and a greater understanding about the impact of what you do. So when we think about inclusion safety, which is stage 1, it's really the focus here is on connection and belonging. When we look at young people in urban environments who join gangs, as young as 8 or 9 or 10, they're searching for something. They want to belong. When we look at football teams, when we look at military units, once people feel like they connect and belong, that's when the real productivity, that's when the real performance happens. We see it in organizations every day. If I feel ostracized or like I'm not a part of the group, if I'm discriminated against, if I'm ostracized, I'm not going to engage. I'm not going to feel like I belong. I'm not going to be connected. And so here, the idea is you want people to feel as though they're valued, they're treated fairly, that their experience, their knowledge, their engagement really matters. And we want people to openly contribute and, more importantly, feel like they openly contribute. Once you address inclusion safety, you move to the next phase, which is learner safety. This is all about learning and growth. Do I feel safe? Do I feel like I can engage? Can I learn? Can I get feedback? Can I provide feedback to others? Can I try things out? Can I acknowledge mistakes without harming my coworkers and friends? So the idea here is I want people to feel safe to discover and ask questions and experiment. I want them to learn from their mistakes, and I want them to look for new opportunities, because this is where real innovation happens. This is creativity. So the next stage is collaborator safety. This is where people feel like they're beginning to make a difference. They're more empowered. They maximize their skills. They're contributing to the organization. Everything they've done up to this point, they're belonging, they're learning, they're taking risks, is having enduring impact. They feel like they can engage in an unconstrained way. They can interact with people. They trust people. They have mutual access to knowledge and relationships. This is where we see people having constructive debate. Now, if you haven't seen psychological safe organizations and you observe this, you might think that it's tension, and you might think that it's conflict, and you might think that it's dysfunctional. But as we see in many team development books and learnings, it's that level of tension and friction that often, when managed appropriately, makes the organization great. The fourth and final stage of psychological safety is where everything pays off. You can challenge the system. You can identify opportunities. This is organizations that claim to be continuously improving, or to be focused in the way that we think about Lean Six Sigma on improving and eliminating waste. This is where they thrive. The ultimate goal is to get better and better and better and achieve the organization's goals and mission by challenging the status quo, speaking up, and expressing new ideas, exposing problems, identifying changes, and growing the organization. Here's how you know you're in an organization that is psychologically safe. Mistakes are treated as learning. Learning is strategic. Performance reviews are conducted, and it's part of the improvement process. It's not something you do once a year when everyone lines up outside your boss's door or hopes for an appointment. It's every day. Everyone's encouraged to take risk, even when they're outside each other's comfort zone. And employees are being shared. There's a diversity in every way that you can possibly define diversity. So now you know what psychological safety is. You know the 4 phases and how it develops in organizations. How do you assess psychological safety in organizations? Well, you can take a qualitative approach, or you can take a quantitative approach. You can measure it by engaging in things like focus groups and interviews and observations, or you can use survey instruments to identify how psychologically safe an organization is. At Workforce Systems Design, we like to use both. Amy Edmondson, in her writing, has identified 10 questions that you can use, and you can use this in an informal or a formal way. You can train your HR staff or your process improvement staff to engage in and facilitate focus groups where you pull this information, or it can just simply be, where a leader comes in, sits down with his team, and asks that question. If you make a mistake on the team, it's going to be held against you. If you bring up problems and tough issues, are you going to be okay? What happens when sometimes people feel different? Does the team reject them? Once you're rejected, can you get back into the good graces of the team? Can you take risks? Can you ask other people for help? Do you feel safe and trusted in such a way that you don't feel like people are deliberately taking you out, harming you, playing not to lose? When you work with others on the team, do they value you? Do you value them? Can you speak up with what's on your mind? Is there a process for that? If you make a mistake, are you done on this team? Is it time to look for a new job? Are people comfortable disagreeing with each other? So this would be more of a qualitative way to look at psychological safety. Workforce Systems Design, we actually developed something we call the PsychSafe Survey, where we have about 35 questions, and then we can customize that to a certain degree, where we go out and we ask your employees, very similar to an employee engagement survey. And in fact, we often use data from employee engagement surveys, or either we augment our work with them, so that you get a comprehensive picture of not just whether or not your employees are engaged, but do you have an environment that permits that engagement, risk-taking, and encourages people to engage in those 4 phases that we talked about. So this is a company, we're going to just call it X-Ray 134. X-Ray 134 is a manufacturing firm, high-tech manufacturing. They produce sensors and electronic devices for the automotive industry. So we did this, and I guess there were probably 700 some odd employees. We got about 634 responded to us. And we noticed a couple things in the demographic data that about 3/4 were over the age of 45. With this industry and with the type of workers, we weren't too surprised about that, but it does remind the HR people and the leadership team that they have a maturing workforce and they need to take action to educate and encourage and pull other people into it. Again, based on this industry, because of the high-tech nature, about half had a graduate degree, and the greater proportion of those degrees were either engineering or technology related. When we looked at the overall workforce, about 40%, 37% had had a bad experience at work. Now, 71% believed that the firm was going to be successful, even though they had had bad experiences, which, all of us do. 90% believed that they had been treated fairly. And that is one of the highest numbers when we do this survey. We also see there's a big relationship, a high relationship between being treated fairly, or the perception of being treated fairly, trust, and employability, how long you're going to stay there, tenure, if you want to think about it that way. Now, the interesting thing with this organization, even though they felt people were treated fairly and they believed the organization was going to be successful, we found that 23% would not recommend their firm to others. In most organizations, when we see high data, as we see in these other categories, and see low data here, that typically means that either the work environment, not as we think about safety, but the actual strenuousness of it, or leaders in the organization have somehow led in a way or sent messages, or at least the people perceive that they have in a way that would not, that other people might not want to be there. Therefore, I'm not going to recommend the firm. Sometimes people say, well, wow, that's really because they like it so here. They don't want anyone coming and compete for their jobs. We've been doing this survey for over a decade, and in the follow-up, that has never, ever, ever come up. That the reason I wouldn't recommend people is because I'm trying to keep my good thing. Now, in this case, 32% would passively recommend their firm to others, meaning they wouldn't advocate, but if someone said, hey, mind if I apply, or what do you think? They wouldn't necessarily give them negative information. And then what we did think was in line with the other data we're seeing in this firm is 47 would actively recommend the firm to employers, meaning they're almost a recruiter. They would tell you about it at church. They would tell you about it at the PTA meeting. They would tell you about it at the grocery store, what a great company I work for. Now, the thing that might be a little bit of a bias here is this company offers headhunting bonuses. So if I work on third shift and I recruit another technology analyst, or I recruit another lab worker to join me on the third shift or join the company, period, you get a bonus. And so there's an incentive for you to actively recommend. So this is some of the data. We can also pull it and cut it by department, by leader, and so forth. So the last part of our discussion is really going to be about how you map out culture in a family-owned business. And how do you do that in a way that engages people and creates a environment for psychological safety and performance improvement. And so I like to use a parable that's been around for a couple thousand years. Actually, it's a combination of two parables. One is it's from the Judeo-Christian worldview. It comes from Matthew in the New Testament of the Holy Bible. And it's essentially Jesus or the shepherd is, he has 100 sheep and one goes away. Can't find him. And so he leaves all the other 99, all of those in their safe, warm comfort of the flock, and he goes in search for that one that got away. And then when he finds him and he brings the sheep back, he's so happy and he's glad to have him, and he rejoices that that one sheep came back. Now, we can talk about it in spiritual terms and what it really means, but in this way, we're talking about it from the perspective of we have a great team. We have a great organization, but there's one or two or maybe a dozen people who don't seem to fit. Our job as leaders is to figure out how to make them fit. The second metaphor related to sheep is the parable of the bummer lamb. When a lamb is born, sometimes, and especially when there's two lambs born from the same ewe, you'll have one that might have a deformity. And so the sheep, as they call them, bummer lambs, their mouth are not, they're weak. They don't have the ability to suckle. And so after a while, the mother, believing it's not going to survive, pushes it out. And then when the mother pushes it out, the flock pushes it out. So now actively, the flock is trying to push that bummer lamb away from them. Now, in organizations, we see that all the time. When we push people out, we deprive them of resources. We roll their eyes. Again, we treat them as though they're not a part of the flock, and bad things happen. So as it relates to the bummer lamb, a shepherd will go out. They'll feed that little lamb by hand. They'll put the lamb in its clothing so it stays warm. At night, they'll sleep with it to keep it warm. And when the lamb is healthy and it's fully formed and it's able to take care of itself, more or less, the shepherd reintroduces that lamb to the flock. And at that point, he's part of the team. And the interesting thing is when that shepherd calls in his entire flock and calls them to him at the end of the day, which lamb is there first? It's that bummer lamb. Which lamb is the one that is going to make sure that no matter where, no matter what, it's there with that shepherd? It's going to be that bummer lamb. And so in organizations, we need leaders who can reach out to those bummer lambs, those employees that might be on the outskirts, those that might not feel like they belong. And they create that environment of belonging, and they help create a space where trust and respect and caring and belonging, that all employees are valued, all employees are included. And that is probably the most important thing when we talk about creating psychological safety in family-owned businesses, is how that founder, how those leaders, how those generations from first to second to third to fourth and so on, how are they instilling trust? How are they creating those environments for respect? Are they letting people engage in a way that allows them to take risk, knowing that the mistake won't end their career? So for that leader to make an environment where psychological safety exists, they have to create a place where trust exists. They have to create a place where respect exists. They have to model that behavior to the other employees. They have to reinforce that and communicate the expectations. And when people act in a way that doesn't instill trust, that doesn't reinforce a respectful environment, it's up to that family owner, that leader, to say, hey, wait a minute. This is our organization. This is what we want. And this is what psychological safety looks like. This is what a healthy culture looks like. And then that leader cascades down that leadership to the next levels. So how do family-owned businesses leaders drive that psychological safety? They publicly announce that this is the way we're going to operate. This is how we're going to exist. They articulate the business case for it. They talk about the return on investment, and they start developing the skills and educating the workforce and the leaders particularly on how to engage those bummer sheep, how to pull those people into the flock, how to maximize the engagement. They build empathy and team cohesion, and they actually start talking about psychological safety as a competency, just as you talk about controlling, just as you talk about managing and planning and feedback. Psychological safety is a part of what we do. It's a part of our DNA as leaders. And then, as so many people have said before, if you don't measure it, don't ask people to do it, because what gets measured gets done. And in this case, it's easy to develop criteria and performance feedback mechanisms around psychological safety that you can feed into your performance appraisal and performance management system. And then once you do that, you start connecting compensation to how well those leaders develop the environment for psychological safety. So, and what we know from our earlier discussion is leaders define the culture. Culture defines what success looks like. People who are successful become leaders. So there's this cycle again and again and again. And often I'll go into an organization and I'll hear a CEO say, oh, our culture stinks. After they see this, they realize, oh, wait a minute, that's me. Can you have a CEO who has great culture, but in his engineering department, you have a bad culture? Sure you can. But that engineering leader is responsible for that department's culture, and that CEO is responsible for that engineering leader managing that culture. So here's a little checklist that we often provide our frontline managers all the way up to our executives. It's just a little checklist, and sometimes we put this on the back of that index card that we started our presentation with. Learn about psychological safety, participate, be intentional about it, set expectations, hold people accountable. And you do this through things like after action reviews and retrospectives, where you bring people in after an event or you bring people in during a certain period of time and you ask those questions that Dr. Edmondson provides for us, those 10 questions, or you provide them with the results from our survey. Show vulnerability and show emotions. Be firm with negative behaviors. She may be the best salesperson in your company, but if her turnover rate is high and people don't want to come to work and people don't want to be engaged, maybe it's not worth that sales. Maybe there's another salesperson out there who can create the culture you want as well as generate the productivity that you need. Admit mistakes and fault yourself. Model what it looks like to have the psychologically safe attitude. And by all means, the golden rule's been along for a long time. Now, this is not the he who has gold rules. This is the do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And there's activities that a leader can engage in or organization can engage in. One that I like is called donut runs, or you can call them CEO talk times, or you can provide a healthy snack, whatever you want. But essentially, you have senior executive round, as we talk about it in the medical world, but you have them go to where the work is. Take in the shift 15 minutes early or 30 minutes early one day a month. Take a treat around. And when people are sitting around having a cup of coffee, eating a donut, often they're open and they'll talk to you and they'll engage. And you can get a sense for if that unit's psychologically safe, if the leader buys into it, if the team leader buys in. When we do internal leadership academies, there's always a block on psychological safety, and it's typically one of the first blocks. And then we reinforce these elements of psychological safety when we talk about feedback, when we talk about planning, when we talk about dealing with conflict. It just becomes the golden thread that is in the Leadership Academy. No matter what the topic is, you're going to be talking about creating that environment for psychological safety. Another thing we encourage organizations to do is when the HR people are designing their employee engagement surveys, we pop these measures right in there, and it's really easy to do. You're also seeing more national organizations like Gallup and Accenture and Deloitte who do employee engagement surveys. You're seeing them include often a psychological safety index. And then practice listening, create a listening culture. Often in organizations, just like in sports teams or military units, we get a false sense of bravado and we think that, razzing people or zinging people, we think it's humorous and we think it motivates. But the fact is, we need to encourage people to talk to each other respectfully and honestly in ways that create trust. And often that's part of the listening culture. So who's responsible? We know who. The leader, whether it's the CEO of the company or the team leader. They have to make it a priority. It has to be based on respect. There has to be trust. Feedback has to be open and honest and as objective as it can be. We have to recognize when people are doing well, and we have to understand those 4 stages of psychological safety. And like with anything worthwhile, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes resources. A great little activity as you try to reinforce those things is called the Culture Design Canvas. And essentially, we encourage you to do this with your employee team, your leadership team, with your board of directors. You can do this at all levels. But what you're doing here is you're trying to make sure everybody understands the culture and the workplace you're trying to create. And so Think about it as a painting canvas. There's a section where you talk about how you make decisions, who has the authority to make decisions, how are we going to prioritize things. Are there elements about our culture that we always want to drive our decisions and our behaviors? Do we have rituals? Do we celebrate things? Do we celebrate people? Do we make sure that we reinforce elements of the culture that's working for us? How do we give feedback? How do we run meetings? Just articulating this so that everybody knows what it is. Are there norms and rules that help us, sometimes hurt us? What are they? And when we think about behaviors, what do we punish? What do we reward? And this is all based on our mission and our vision. Why do we exist, and what do we believe in? What do we want to be? And if you can map this out and you can articulate it just on a simple sheet of paper or maybe a really big index card, then you get to the point where you can define what psychological safety looks like in your firm. How do we encourage people to speak up? How do we get people to participate? How do we encourage people to be candid? Feel free to print this out and use this blank. I attributed where I got it. It's a great organization that talks about fearless culture. Their website is there if you want more information from them. You don't have to use their form. But these are the categories that we're looking for you to lead as a leader. So we talked about some updates around small businesses. We talked about how they contribute to the economy, some challenges that people face as they manage their family-owned enterprises. We also began the conversation around psychological safety. Now, will you change tomorrow? Will your organization overnight become psychologically safe? No. But you can lay the foundation today, and you can begin to intentionally work toward creating the space that you want and your employees deserve. And I would just leave you with the old Sears model. If you take care of your employees, they'll take care of your customers. If you take care of your customers, you'll be competitive and productive. If you're competitive and productive, you will continue, you'll grow, and you'll be around for generations to come. If you have any questions about this presentation, feel free to reach out to me. Again, Richard Ray. I'm at Workforce Systems Design. Our email is there. You can also follow us on X now. We've converted that from Twitter, of course. And we want you to think about psychological safety in this way. It's not the thing to do. It's the thing to do so that every other thing you do is more productive. If you build a good railway system, any train you put on that railway will get to the destination that you desire. So thank you to the Board of Directors of the Kim S. Miller Family Enterprise Institute of South Carolina. Thank you to Anderson University. We were excited about sponsoring this event. We were also excited that Dr. Ray could present on this really important topic. So hope you enjoyed Creating Safe Cultures, Psychological Safety, and the Family Enterprise. Please reach out to us if you have questions.